Hey guys, I'm Nashwa. Welcome back to my channel. And today I'm being joined by another booktuber, Bakhtawar. And she has her own booktube channel. She is also from Pakistan. And we recently connected on Instagram, I think, and then from there to YouTube. So this is going to be another video in the series of collaborations that I'm doing. And I'll let Bakhtawar introduce herself.
Hi guys, I'm Bakhtawar. I have a small booktube channel, very small compared to Nashwa's great channel. It's called Book Bakht. And I started talking to Nashwa a few months ago, I think a couple of months ago, and we decided to do this collaborative video, and I'm very happy that we did. So yeah, so stay tuned for some fun.
What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about Pakistani fiction. I dedicated the entire month of August to reading Pakistani fiction. And today we're going to talk about what we like about Pakistani fiction, what particularly doesn't work for us, and the best and the worst of the books that we've read. And we'll also talk about some of the books that we're excited to read. So the first question in a series of questions that we came up with is the fact that do our Pakistani authors write from experience? Because in my opinion, sometimes you read a book and it seems so far removed from the reality of this country, and you do wonder that if this is something genuine, if this is something that they're writing from experience, or it's something that they've heard of, like they've heard of this terrorist incident in some far off part of the country and they decided to write a book about it. And I've observed this in a couple of books. But what do you think? Do you think that Pakistani writers write from experience?
I think the Pakistani writers, first of all, let's tackle their sort of mindset, what I consider their mindset. I think they have, because obviously somebody who's writing in English is very unlikely to have, I don't know, close connections with the sort of things that they're writing about, which of course are important to write about. But I think they, because of obviously the way they're writing and everything, it's very unlikely that they've witnessed any of it firsthand, which makes people who are Pakistani, like you and me, it makes us kind of almost suspicious in a way, which I know doesn't sound too great, but it kind of, it makes us think, do they really know what they're talking about? And of course, empathy has its way into writing. It always does. But how far can it go? And also it needs to be handled very delicately, because sometimes it becomes kind of, it's like you're almost, I don't know, making a kind of a joke of it almost, and like not in a satire, like satire is fine, but I mean that's what I tend to think sometimes.
I think that writers have done this, and I'm going to take a name because we're going to name drop in this video. And before we actually get into the conversation, there's a couple of disclaimers that we should have mentioned in the beginning. But if you're watching this, we'll just tell you now that we're not experts on Pakistani fiction. At least I don't consider myself one.
By no means, yeah.
Yeah, we're people who read these books and then we're like, wait, that doesn't sound quite right. So if you're somehow offended by us taking names of authors, please don't be. We're not trying to offend anyone, or we're not trying to make Pakistani writers or readers feel bad, because I don't know how many people this will reach, but I feel like Bakhtawar has parrots, if you can hear that. Us people.
He's got his opinion.
He's got his opinion, and I feel like people do get a little emotional when we talk about Pakistani fiction, because they're like, you can't criticize. But actually, we can, and it's coming from a place of wanting something to get better rather than just hating on it. So we're not going to hate on any authors or any books. We're just trying to discuss this from a very literary perspective, in a way that what really works in our fiction.
So, yeah, and an analytical perspective as well, which is actually essential, because that's what, I mean, not that we're necessarily literary critics, but I mean, that's a whole thing, that's a whole field actually.
Yeah. So a couple of the authors that I feel like don't write from their experience. The first one that comes to mind, and this is Mohsin Hamid. I recently finished The Reluctant Fundamentalist. Like, by recently, I mean yesterday. And it's 200 pages, and it took me 10 days. And normally, like, 200 pages just isn't that long. And it's because he was writing about the whole 9/11 experience and everything. And he is talking about this in a way which is much far removed from the reality on the ground. So like, I feel like he's the kind of person that I'm a little suspicious about, and he has won literary prizes. So there's that element of, oh, he's writing this because he knows it's political and he knows this is what the literary prize is like. So in that like mindset, I feel like he's not writing from his experience, but he's writing from the perspective of what really works in the international community, and the point of like, impressing an audience which is not necessarily their own. And it sucks because then you feel like then they don't care about their own people. Like, why are you not reflecting us?
And you know, I saw an interview of Mohsin Hamid where he was talking about the reluctant fundamentalist, and I remember he said something like he saw a guy in a bar, like a regular guy, a Muslim guy, I think from the beard and everything, and he said that guy was just looking at the screen where 9/11 was playing. What are the chances? But anyway, and then the guy had like a strange smile on his face, and that actually just sort of got the ball rolling for his novel. He's like, oh, maybe I could create a character that is happy that this has happened, and that he's actually this really, you know, previously glamorous, educated in America, that sort of person. And you know, what if you convert that sort of person who actually isn't even from the tribal areas and has no such connections, and then you turn that person into fun? I thought he found that concept interesting, but it's executed poorly, firstly, and secondly, a lot of it seems to be, I hate to use the word borrowed, but you know, from The Fall by Albert Camus, which is also written in this sort of conversational style where he has this unnamed stranger and he's telling him, oh, you know, this is what happened, this is the story of my life. So when I was reading it, I'd actually read The Fall. No, actually, I'd read The Reluctant Fundamentalist a long time ago. But when I read The Fall, like 6 months ago, I was like, oh my God, did Mohsin Hamid just get this idea, this style maybe from, so that kind of
I felt that too, and I felt it like because I haven't read The Fall or any of Camus' work, but I read a lot of like Polonic, and I recently read Don DeLillo's Cosmopolis, and in that, like, it does seem like an imitation of some of these, like not a direct copy, but like heavily drawn inspiration from,
heavily inspired, true.
heavily inspired by people, and there's nothing wrong with being inspired, but because the content seems unoriginal, and because the writing seems very distant, so there's no connection between the writing and the story. So one of those things has to work. Like, it's either the writing that has to work for you, or it has to be the storytelling. So you recently read The Runaways, or you're reading it by Fatima Bhutto, and
Yeah, I'm finished actually. I was reading it last night as well. I had like a few pages left. So yeah, that also, of course, it has all of these on the face of it, really lovely themes, you know, sort of classism, and then, you know, young people turning to fundamentalism when they really don't have a reason to. And one of the characters is this BBCD, this British-born confused Desi, if you will. And then the girl is a Christian girl who's always been ostracized by society. And then the third character is like, you know, some really rich guy who's kind of spoiled, and he's actually involved with the girl that I just mentioned. So obviously the idea on the face of it is great, but again, the execution is, because obviously it's like some 420 pages, and it could easily have been 175 pages, 200, and she could still have made all the points that. So it kind of draws on without, like, there's, I think, maybe something like 30-40 pages in between in which these two guys are trudging across a desert, and it's to no avail. There's no connection with it to anything, and I was like, what was this for? Was it just to fill up? So execution is a problem, and then obviously I don't think she has direct experience with any of these particular characters. So I mean, she has tried to, but again, the writing I had a problem with, which was that the writing is too simple. I know that's not a problem for a lot of people, but sometimes when something is too simple, it kind of hurts. So it was like it's too simple, and you know, I didn't like that as much.
so
But I
just
appreciated the themes. The themes were nice, I mean, I suppose.
So just for a little bit context, Fatma Bhutto is a very, very famous writer in Pakistan. And most of the fame is because she comes from a very large political family. So that's why we're discussing the fact that her content, the things that she's writing about, because I haven't read her, but Bakhtawar has, so I'm going to rely on her. But I know
Mhm.
her political background. Her aunt used to be the prime minister of Pakistan a couple of decades ago, and then she was assassinated. So part of that is that you're coming from a huge political family, and you're writing about things which again seem very far removed from the kind of experiences that you're writing about. So again, I think that ties into our question of, are they writing from experience? But now we move on to the next part of this conversation, that do you need to write from experience? Like, do you need to live through things? Because writers can essentially write about anything. Like, if you haven't experienced war, you don't have to write about war. And I feel like they don't need that experience, because look at all the fantasy writers and the sci-fi writers. Like, they're writing, they've never existed in those worlds, but they've written about it and they've done really well. So the question is, do they need the experience to write about these things, or they just need to do more research?
You know, I this brings something really interesting to mind because I remember reading somewhere. I think it was one of those that really silly articles that teach you how to write as if that's something you can learn. But it said something like, you know, you have a small experience. For example, you have a feeling of panic that you've lost your wallet, for example. So then when you're writing, you think about, you know, what if I had lost my child? What if I had lost something infinitely more valuable? So the feeling that you actually did experience, you kind of keep elaborating it till it applies to things which are far more serious. And apparently that's a writing technique that's very well known. But again, it has to be executed well. And I would mention the example of Bapsi Sidhwa because, you know, when she wrote The Bride, which, you know, we both read recently and you also discussed in your video, like, I'm pretty sure she's never been adopted or lived in the mountains and, you know, dunk bread and water and eaten it. And so it's all observation, but you can see the really stark difference between what she writes and what somebody like, for example, Fatima Bhutto writes or Mohsin Hamid. There's a stark difference. Like she can sort of exercise her empathy to the extent that she can really imagine being those people with their hopes and dreams and sufferings. And it's very, very effective in her case, despite the fact that she doesn't have direct, I mean, I'm assuming she doesn't because she's not ethnically belonging to those groups. She's, I'm pretty sure, never lived in those areas also. So, you know, so apparently maybe a writer that has remarkable skill like that would actually fare better.
So I think in some cases, like she's lived through them, because if you read Ice Candyman or Cracking India, like she lived through the partition. She was
Yeah.
the same age as the main character is in that book. So I feel like some of her writing definitely comes from experience. But what I'm trying to say is that you don't really have to live through that experience. And I think you agree when you mentioned that Babsi said
Yeah.
who wrote The Bride, like she didn't really live through that lifestyle. She's not from the mountains. And she just knows of it and how to write about it. So for her, I think both things work for her, that she's writing from experience, but she's also able to empathize. But there are writers who've written about things that they haven't lived through and they've done really well. And this brings the example of Cartography by Kamila
True.
to my mind, because it's not one of my favorite books. I think it was considered a favorite of mine for a long time. And then I reread it and I'm like, okay, this has a lot of plot holes. This doesn't work for me. When I read it
Yeah.
in my late 20s, I was like, no, this is not really working for me. But she talks about the 1971 civil war, which led to the creation of Bangladesh. And she talks about it
Yeah.
well. And yesterday, while we were discussing the preliminary discussion, we actually checked when she was born, and she was born after the creation of Bangladesh. But she still talks about the ethnicity of it, the different cultures and everything. And she talks about it well. So I think like writers can write about anything, but they just have to have the kind of research ability to make the
And
story,
skill, I think.
yeah, to make the story sound more genuine. So now we're going to move on to the next part of our video, which is basically talking about our favorite Pakistani books. And if you had asked me 6 months ago to tell me about my favorite Pakistani books, I would not have been able to come up with an answer, because
You would have had nothing to nothing to say. Radio silence.
yeah, radio silence, because I hadn't read enough. But this year, because I'm trying to make more of an active effort to read like Pakistani books and then realize like which ones are good and which ones are bad. So I have like a list of books that I consider good and I consider like something that I would recommend to other people. Now, the thing with recommendations is that I love recommending, but I get so nervous when people actually tell me that they've picked it up and I'm like, oh no, I hope you don't hate me, or I hope you don't end up disliking it. So
Pressure is real.
yeah. So, like, what are some of the best Pakistani books that you've read?
I would have to say The Prisoner by Omar Shahid Hamid because, like what we were discussing earlier, he actually has a lot of experience with what he's writing because he writes primarily crime thrillers set sort of in Karachi, and, you know, how political parties behave, how the police obviously behaves, how crime is kind of organized. And I think he's been a police officer at a pretty good post for possibly 20 years or something. So he's not just familiar with if I may call it that, the indigenous language of the streets, but he's also really, he's a keen observer of, you know, the intricacies of the, you know, the behavior of the criminals and the behavior of regular people, you know, in response, and even people that aren't criminals, obviously. So his perception is so remarkable. I remember I read The Prisoner a few years ago, and that was obviously his first book and also the first book I'd read of him because he'd written a couple by then. And I'm not even somebody who likes crime thrillers, actually. But he's quite remarkable. And then I went on to read The Party Worker, which is maybe his third book, and again, it was quite nice. And I was like, somebody who can draw you in when it's not even your favorite genre, and he can, you almost feel like you're there with him. The dirt and grunge of the city, and the expressions on people's faces, what they look like before they shoot somebody dead. It's just so real the way he's done it, and that made me think, just like you said, that it's because he's seen this day in and day out. But then again, he can add his own remarkable skill to it, really.
Yeah, and that's an author that when you mentioned him, I have never heard of him. Like, I mean, I'm not very well versed in Pakistani fiction anyway. I just pick whatever I see in the bookstores. I go to the websites and I'm like, okay, this looks like it's Pakistani. So when you mentioned this author yesterday, I was like, oh, I should definitely check him out because I do like this genre. And I don't know if I've ever read a South Asian like crime thriller, because most of our stories are based on certain themes, some of them very political, some of them like are very tragic. And you always have this like heaviness when you're trying to pick up a Pakistani book because you're like, I know this is going to make me like feel things. It's going to either make me very angry or it's going to make me like partly traumatized. So when you read a crime thriller by a Pakistani author, this is something that I'm definitely very interested in. You yesterday mentioned a book of short stories that you really like.
Yeah, I really liked Daniel Muinuddin's In Other Rooms, Other Wonders, which I think I also reviewed on my channel. I thought it was really good because I'm so sorry. So anyway, so what I really liked about his collection of short stories was that not only is the prose really, really sophisticated, but then again, he adds again the real feeling of authenticity to what he writes, because his father actually was a feudal landowner. I think he's passed away now, and Daniel Muinuddin has taken over the farm, so to speak, from what I read. So he really knows about the dynamics in a way, but he captures it beautifully, and he kind of tends to focus on people that you wouldn't notice, maybe not that anybody is a snob or anything, but sometimes one doesn't notice people that work for you, or people that till the fields. You never stop to think about what are they thinking about all day, or the small, the shack type where they live and they've not got any electricity. We never stop to think in great detail of how they must be feeling, but he kind of captures it as if he's observed it at least in great detail. So I found it quite illuminating, and I think it's the only thing he's written. He wrote nothing afterwards, which if he would, I would read it, definitely.
So I have had that book for a long time. I haven't read it yet. I was planning to read it, but like somehow short stories and I don't like. I find them harder to read. I prefer like a closely knit narrative, not narrative fiction. So that's one book that now that you've mentioned that it's good, I'm definitely bumping it up on the books that I wanted to read. So some of my favorite books are definitely like I love Ice Candy Man or Cracking India by Bapsi Sidhwa. And I read it very recently, and I feel like Bapsi Sidhwa's books have been a steady, like they've been steady for me. They are different because sometimes like they talk about different things and different themes. Some of them are much funnier than the others, but like I like them for different reasons. And because Cracking India talks about partition, I think it's a story that it has been taught to us in a way which was very political and it was biased in one way. Because like if you study here, then you hear a different story. But if you talk to someone from the other side, I'm not trying to like create a political discussion here, but definitely the way that we're told our stories are very, very biased. So I really like Cracking India, and Bapsi Silva's The Crow Eaters happens to be one of my favorite books because it's funnier, it's lighter in tone, and that's the first book that she wrote which shows like an all Parsi cast. So she talks about her own community and she talks about her own people. So I really like that. And another book that I really liked, I read it a few years ago, and it was called How It Happened by Shazaf Fatima Heather. And it was a story that a lot of people criticized because it sounds like a Pakistani soap opera because it's about a family and a family drama and basically siblings getting married and our obsession with like the idea of marriage. But when I read it, I found it incredibly refreshing because that is something that I haven't seen in a lot of books. And that was what I want to see. So what if it sounds like a Pakistani soap opera? It's well written, it's executed well, it's funny, and it tells our story. It tells us exactly the way our society functions. Marriages are a big deal. Wedding preparations are a big deal. So when she talked about all of those aspects in the book, I really enjoyed that. And then it's a multi-generational book because the grandmother lives with them and the parents live with them and everyone lives in the same household. And that is such a foreign concept to most people who live in the West, because you move out, like you move out when you're 18 or you're 20 or after university, whenever you do. So you don't really live with your parents, let alone your grandparents. So in
Yeah,
that,
you never move up.
yeah, we don't move out. We live here. We live here with our parents and then we live with our husbands. So like we never live on our own. So
Yeah.
the thing with that was that the idea of multiple generations living together in the West is such like it's a concept that it's hard to understand because they don't do it. But in our society, it's very normal to have your grandmother or your grandfather live with you. And I thought that portrayal in that book was very, very refreshing, and I really liked that. But another book that I read recently, it's called Greetings from Berry Park, and it's a memoir of a Pakistani journalist, not a Pakistani journalist, a Pakistani British journalist who moved to the UK at the age of 3. And he's basically been living there. So in his memoir, he struggles talking about religion, his identity, because when he moved, his parents were like English, not Pakistani. And that is something that I found incredibly refreshing to read about, in a way that I just thought it would be another one of those over-the-top memoirs, but he actually takes his time to explain the perspective of his parents. And again, I struggled to keep this book in one category. I wasn't sure if I should count it as a Pakistani book or as a British book. But in the entirety of the book, the author struggles with his identity. So I feel like it's completely fair for me to struggle a little bit with the idea that in which group or category does it belong. So that was one that I read in the same week, and I really, really liked it.
Been a real debate, like, do people that maybe have never lived here as such, people like Hanif Qureshi or Mirza Waheed, people that moved away when they were, and also Amir Hussain, who I have a book of, but I've never read him. And these are people who've spent their entire life in another country, Britain mostly, and they've maybe just visited a couple of times. So there's a real debate that does their work and their experience count as Pakistani? Of course, it counts as fiction, and I'm sure it's excellent quality, but does it count as the Pakistani experience? But I suppose maybe it does, I guess, in a certain, maybe their experience as a second generation immigrant or something.
I think definitely you can't really say, oh, because you were born in another country or because like you're not from here, in the sense that you didn't live and grow up here, like you're not Pakistani. That's not for us to say. But whenever
True.
we're talking about even diasporic writers, who most of Pakistanis, like writers who were even we're reading today, like they live somewhere else. So like they are Pakistani, but it's that element of confusion you have. Another author that is very popular in Pakistan is Muhammad Hanif, and I think in our experiences we've witnessed both the best and the worst from him. I've read 2 of his books. The first one was A Case for Exploding Mangoes, and the other one was Our Lady of Alice Bhatti. And with me, one of the books didn't really work for me. That was A Case of Exploding Mangoes. I think I gave it 2 stars because I remember buddy reading it with like Britta, who's a German booktuber, a couple of years ago, and we were both like, it doesn't work for us because for me that element of satire was a little bit crass. And I know people will say you're not smart enough to get it, and maybe I'm not, but like I'm allowed to criticize a book.
Absolutely.
Which I don't think works for me, because for me it felt very scattered. There was a lot of random things happening, and I'm like, that doesn't work for me. And in my opinion, and this is something that might come across a little bit sexist, but I feel like it's the kind of book that would appeal more to a male audience. So
Yeah, I think that is true.
yeah, so A Case of Exploding Mangoes didn't really work for me, but I recently read Alice 30, and I really enjoyed that because it talks about the Christian minority in Pakistan, and that's something that is not reflected in our books. And then when I was researching him, he basically said that he's not interested in writing outside of Pakistan. He doesn't want to portray Pakistan for an international audience. He'll talk about his people for his own people. So
Yeah.
that's something that I absolutely appreciated about him, because like I disliked one very much, and the other one I was like, okay, I'm very impressed with how he handled a very sensitive debate, because talking about minorities can become difficult.
When I read the case for exploding mangoes, so what happened was, I think I read it at a time when I didn't mind so much that it was overly reliant on humor alone, because like you said, there are serious kind of sort of gaps in the plot and everything. But I think I didn't notice it at the time because it was making me laugh. So I was like, all right, this is fine, this is funny. Then there was a few clever bits in, so I did enjoy it. I'd be lying if I said that I didn't. And I really enjoyed it, but I think that was also because of the context of my life, what was happening, and I found it. And then I really liked, again, for its portrayal of the Christian minority, and the woman who, the main character, who's a nurse, and her father is, I think he's a sweeper or something. So but then I read Redbirds, because I thought that, the first two were excellent. I bought Redbirds, and that actually gave me the kind of idea to sort of begin my channel in a way, because I remember that I searched for Redbirds on YouTube, which is like, the second most important search engine after Google. And I found almost nothing. And I was like, why is there nothing? Is there like, because for everything you want a review, right? I mean, in today's world anyway. So I didn't find anything. And I respond sometimes better to like a video format. So anyway, I thought, I was like, maybe, maybe I should review books that everybody else seems to be ignoring, although it is a popular book. But then I read it and I didn't like it at all, and I did a review on it, and it wasn't funny, so it didn't check the first box. It also, again, it had almost no plot. Almost no plot. Whatever plot there was, I think he covered it in the first 20 pages, and then the rest was just in the wind. So
So I
that
have,
one was
but I was planning to read it, but then I'm not sure because, like, I think it looks like it's a mixture of both the first books, like A Case of Exploding Mangoes and Our Lady of Alice Bhatti. But I'm not sure if I'll pick this one up because, because I've read two of his books, I'm a little reluctant to step into one which doesn't really have a plot. And if it's not funny, that's like also taking away from it.
true.
So yeah, they're like, now that we've discussed the best and the worst, I think we know we've discussed the best. We haven't gotten to the worst yet because haven't really began the salty part of our conversation. That we've discussed the best, and we I feel like now we can say that we have a lot of liking towards Pakistani fiction because there are people who have definitely done it really well, and there are people who appeal to the sensitivities of a local audience. So now we move on to the worst Pakistani books, and I thought we would have a lot more books to talk about. Like, I thought it would be like a 10 book list, but I'm
Yeah,
very happy to see that, like, we don't really think that many books are bad. Like,
true.
they're off topic and some of them seem very distant, but like when it comes to actually bad books, there's not that many of them. So like, what are the two or three books that you would consider like, this is bad, I wouldn't recommend it to anyone?
So recently I picked up the readings reprint of Meatless Days by Sarah Soleri. I hadn't heard anything about it or anything. I was just, I think, more out of curiosity because, again, like you, I'd been looking to find the next grave. Although it's written a long time ago. The issue with that was that while, and I think I might actually be contradicting myself here, because here I was looking for sophisticated prose, but then when the prose gets too sophisticated, that it's so verbose that I found it hard to digest any of her sentences. And I'm by no means kind of averse to that, averse to difficult language in any way. But it was like, I think there was this whole scene in which she was describing absolutely nothing. It was like somebody is laying a table, and the dadi of her grandmother, for viewers, is sitting down, and she's looking at what's in the plates and everything. And that was like four pages or something of really, really, really difficult prose. And I was like, what? I mean, like, is this worth the so that book I couldn't finish. I couldn't bring myself to finish. And so I didn't like that. I mean, I think that a lot of people, especially in Pakistan, they sometimes, because it's a fine balance, it's a fine line that you have to walk. Sometimes when something is so difficult that it's purposely so that it takes away from not only your understanding but also your enjoyment, I think that is a dangerous line to walk for a writer. And then if it's too simple, you sort of run the risk that more sophisticated readers won't relate to it and they won't like you as much. So I think it's a thin line to walk. But yeah, and other than that, if I was to think, I think obviously How to Get Rich and How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia by Mohsin Hamid, which is, I believe, his third book, which I have no reason why I bought. But that one was really, really forgettable. All I remember is that there was something to do with an entrepreneur who makes bottled water. But it was very terrible and kind of almost I couldn't sit through that one. No, I think the first two, if anybody is to try out Mohsin Hamid, I think they'd be much better off reading Moth Smoke, because I genuinely did like Moth Smoke, and I've read it 2 or 3 times. I genuinely like it, despite the fact that it's depressing, because again, I don't run from the depressing dark bits in in the human condition, so to speak. So Moth is, I believe, in my humble opinion, a masterpiece. But his third book, the one that I just mentioned, is it's almost as if it's not even by the same person. I think he's by that time really under pressure or something to be liked or something by Western audiences, that I didn't appreciate it as much, I don't think.
And I feel like there's like two things that I kind of want to say. That the first thing is like with the over verbosity of it, like the overwortedness of it. I've noticed it in so many books, and it's almost like they've taken the SAT vocabulary and just thrown it into their Microsoft Word, and then they make sentences around it. That like the kind of, and it doesn't really help because to write a good book, in my opinion, again like my opinion, but like you don't need to really use big words to impress an audience. Don't understand those words, and especially if I'm reading like a physical book, it's not like I'm reading on my Kindle where I stop and I look it up. I'm very lazy to look it up on Google. Like if I'm reading a book, I'm not going to make the effort of picking up my phone and like looking up every word.
Absolutely.
But I think it's also like using big words doesn't make the writing.
Exactly, it doesn't make something high quality.
And about Mohsin Hamid, I agree with you that Mott Smoke is his best. I read it a really long time ago and it still stands in my memory. I didn't like it, but I think it's his best because of how much I remember it. And it has like, it talks about the certain cultural rebellion that I think he's the one who's done it well. And after him, this trend of culturally rebellious books started where people are just like going out and drinking and like writing about it, which is not an issue, but write about it well, make it convincing. So I do agree with you that if you have to check out Mohsin Hamid, Mott Smoke is the one to go with. Like you might end up loving it like Bakhtawar did, or you might be like, this is memorable. It's not that great. So I also tried to read Exit West by Mohsin Hamid, and I say try because I couldn't get through it. My experience of it was again the over explaining, the over verbosity of it. Like there's sentences that span over pages. Like you start from the sentence hasn't ended by the time the page is ended. So like it's an attempt to use like really complicated, frustrating kind of language. And again, it won a prize. And then sure, it worked for some people, but the people who I've seen reviews from and the people who I interact with, they're like, yeah, it was pretentious and it was intolerable. So like Exit West is something that I tried and I was like, I don't get along with this writer.
That's often been on my mind. When you hear about all of these books, some of which are genuinely quite nice, you hear about them getting all of these literary prizes. Usually those aren't prizes in the South Asian context of things. And I wonder about is all this the judging of the quality, the literary quality of a South Asian work, is it done by people who actually have knowledge of South Asian literature, or is it done by somebody who says like, oh, there's terrorism, there's a bit of violence, there's other things which nobody wants to talk about. Maybe this has, political or other types of global um, relevance, and let's just give it a prize. That's what we need. Or is it, are these prizes judged by people who belong to Pakistan, or even if you consider like any literature that comes out of Saudi, but let's just consider Pakistani fiction. Is it like people who've lived in Pakistan, who know the culture, who can relate to it? Why is none of the this judging process done by any of them?
Like I don't know enough to know who the judges are. Like I only sometimes follow the prizes, but I'm not like someone who follows literary prizes.
Yeah.
But I do think like they're definitely not. I think there's a committee of people who are probably sitting and like trying to look up books to nominate, and often they're very topical. Like Exit West got nominated, and I think it won because it talked about like refugees and people like migrating to different parts, and it has that element of like magical realism. But like it was a very current issue. Like refugees and immigration is like a very current issue. And yesterday I was yeah and yesterday I was watching Britta's video. She basically follows literary prizes and she's reviewing all the books that have been nominated for the Booker. And she was talking about a book that seems to be nominated because it ties in with the Black Lives Matter movement. But then she reviewed it and said that, it's not done well. Like it's very clunky. It's not a good book, but it's nominated because, it talks about a certain issue. So I think like with literary prizes, I'm not informed enough to know how they work, but I think they definitely look at the politics of it and, like which one is more current. The books that I didn't like, because we had like a detailed discussion in the middle, I'm still going to talk about the books that I've hated because, that's fun. I very recently read a book called This White Knight. and it's by a very young author who's very close to my age. And it was supposed to be a mixture of The Little Women meets The Virgin Suicides. But I haven't read The Little Women. I'll get to it one day. But growing up, The Virgin Suicides was one of my favorite books because it was dark, it was creepy, and it was atmospheric. And this book failed on so many levels because the whole premise is that the four sisters are supposed to be different, and they're supposed to be like very mysterious. And what makes them mysterious, like the author has so much to work with, like give them interesting characteristics, but she uses the most basic things to make them different. Some of these sisters are different because they like to read books at weddings and they don't like social events, and I'm like, that just makes you an introvert. That doesn't really make you a mysterious, creepy, this thing. So another thing that, like, the author also used suicide of a random character, like who I didn't even know existed, to move the story along. That is something I despise in books. Like, why are you using a tragedy just to move the book along? This is again an example of a book that hasn't been researched well, because she also talks about the 1971 war, which led to the creation of Bangladesh, but she talks about it from a very faraway perspective. And the thing is, like, if you want to move your plot along, use something else, come up with like a fictional war because it's fiction. You can do that. But if you're talking about like a 1971 war and you're not really considering the impact of it, then like it doesn't seem like it's well executed. And another issue that I've had with this book was that it was so poorly written that it could have used an editor. And I'm not talking about sentences that needed to cut down, like actual spelling mistakes and grammatical errors. And I don't know if I notice those things because like I'm supposed to notice them. I work for a company that makes me edit and rewrite like contracts and proposals. So like part of my job is to very critically look at documents and see where the mistake is. So when I'm reading something, like if a mistake pops up, like I catch it immediately. So I don't know if it's like my, or I don't know if it's like my overly critical like view of things, or if it's like just something that was really badly written and not edited at all. There were sentences which had missing words, and I was like, okay, let's play a game. And I'm gonna, like, I used to take pictures on Instagram and put it up, like, let's guess the missing word, like, because
I followed those Instagram stories of yours. They were really funny.
yeah, because I think that was the only way that I could get through that book, because it didn't really feel like I was reading it on my own. Like if I was making fun of it and other people were agreeing with how bad it was, then it made me feel like I'm not overreacting, and this is actually quite bad. Another book that I talked about recently in another video was Karachi, You're Killing Me. It's supposed to be this like mid to late 20s journalist living her life as a journalist in Karachi. And again, she's taken this tactic of like talking about the party lifestyle and the culture of drinking and everything. And like in 250 pages, however many long that book was, like, I don't care how much you're partying. Give me a plot line. That's not why I'm reading the book. And the thing, I like, I come across as someone who says like, no, don't drink. Like, that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm saying like, you can explore that lifestyle for all I care. Like, if you don't want to do it, good for you. But if you're into it, like, even more good for you. Like, I'm not sitting here judging people and their lifestyle. But again, if you're putting it in my fiction and you're doing it so forcefully and you're not even doing it well, like, that's when I have a problem. So like, I'm not judging people. They can live however they want to live. But in fiction, if you're like, and it almost seems like, again, a distant perspective that I don't know if she's lived through it or if she's experienced it, but it came across as so incredibly over the top. And when I watched like YouTube reviews for this book, I have not heard one person say that this is a good book, because everybody is like pointing out like all she's focusing is on this culture of prohibition that we have, and like why she's so obsessed with like forcing this narrative down people's throat. Either you're trying to convince people that like this is something that happens, which we know, but you're also like trying to shove this culture of like this party culture down people's throats. And like honestly, that's not why I read books. I'm here for a good story.
I think a lot of writers have kind of taken up sensationalizing it a bit as well, and kind of making it look like some hidden glamorous world. A really disturbing trend that I've been noticing is that a lot of new books, none of which I've read, but one gets bombarded with them on social media and ads and stuff, because now everybody's sponsoring their posts for no reason. So the thing that I found really, well, not disturbing, but kind of awkward, is that people, they keep putting forward these words like, look into the lifestyle of the elite. And this is what happens, like you said, at parties. And this is, what happens when people drink alcohol. And I'm like, I'm not even like, it's not even a moral, like you said, not even a moralistic perspective, but I'm like, what like, there was one tagline in particular that I read. I don't know if I sent it to you. I think I sent it to somebody as a joke, mind you. And it was something like, have a look into the lives of the elite. That was actually the byline for the novel. I don't even remember which one it was. And I was like, what? Or is it like, is it Mutant X-Men Mutant Academy? Have a look at like, of course you would want to look, but why is it like advertised like that? I found that very funny.
Yeah, I think it's
So
just like our cultural rebelliousness that like it shows that, oh, the state can do this, 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 but look at us, and it's like it doesn't make you like, I don't know who needs to hear this, but like it does not make it a good book. Like I think publishers need to take notice
it
of
doesn't make you cool.
that. Sure, like and definitely like the book, it takes away from the value of the book that if you're like capitalizing on these things, but like it makes me happy that people realize that this is bad. Like for all the reviews that I've seen for Karachi, you're killing me, they're like, no, this is bad. Like this is actually bad. And I'm really glad that people recognize that. But it's just the writers and the publishers also have to see that this doesn't always work. So now we move on to the last section of the video because we've been talking for a very long time. It's that Pakistani books that we haven't read, but we are excited to read. So for me, it's a book that I started reading. It's called The Light Blue Jumper, and it's basically sci-fi. And like, I'm not a huge sci-fi fan per se, but I do like books that are funny and satirical and also like a little bit out there. And examples of that are The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and like Space Opera by Catherine M. Valente, one of my favorite like sci-fi books because like it's just funny, it's interesting. And when I started reading this book, it reminded me very heavily of space opera. And that's something that I appreciated because it's sci-fi, it's not grim, and it's set away from Earth. So I'm about like 40 pages into that, and that's one that I'm really, really
The
excited.
Away from Earth really sold me.
Definitely, definitely, because I watched an interview of the author, and she said that this is going to be a series, and that makes me really excited because like I like fantasy series in general, but I'm not a sci-fi fan. But if it's a Pakistani author who is talking about like sci-fi and there's like book 2 coming out, then I'm like, oh, definitely, like it's worth checking out.
I was thinking, it seems like maybe she's the pioneer of sci-fi in Pakistani fiction because I mean, unless I'm wrong, I don't think anyone else has tackled this genre in Pakistani fiction in English before. So
And
it's really amazing. It might be our first sort of fantasy sci-fi series.
yeah,
Um,
I think there's like definitely fantasy writers who keep writing about like our urban legends and our jinns and like that. But sci-fi wise, you might be right. Like I haven't seen a sci-fi book. Like I know of Urdu
yeah.
literature tackling those elements because like I grew up reading Umru Ayar and like those little tiny Urdu novellas that you used to get. So I feel like there's things that the Urdu authors, and that's a whole other like topic. We're just talking about Pakistani
Right.
English. I think like they've explored a lot more topics than I've come across, and I'm not very well versed in Urdu literature at all. So maybe that could be our next video where we talk about like what we need to learn about the Urdu literature. But I feel like you might be right that something contemporary sci-fi might be the first of its kind. The other book that I'm excited to read, it's called Soul Rivals, and it's basically non-fiction, but it takes into account how Sufi music has influenced our politics. And I think that's a very, very interesting perspective because I like the element of Sufi music in our own industry. I like Qawwalis, and it's interesting to see how like that music has influenced politics. So it's a very short nonfiction book that I'm excited.
I really want to pick that up. That sounds like really right down my alley. I'd really want to pick
Yeah,
that up, I think.
by Nadeem Farooq Paracha, who's also like a famous journalist, and he's written like another book of essays called Points of Entry, which I'm also reading recently. But now, tell me about the books that you're excited to read.
Well, I recently bought Saints and Charlatans, which is also published by Mongrel Press, because The Light Blue Jumper is also a Mongrel published book. So I really want to read Saints and Charlatans. I think it's written by a first-time author, but apparently it's gotten like stellar reviews. I mean, there's not been a video review, I don't think, but wherever I read, everybody said that it was very insightful and everything. So I really want to pick that up. I've actually bought it, but haven't read it yet. Other than that, I bought recently Daddy's Boy by Shandana Minas. and I really want to pick that up as well. It's so weird. Like I was telling you this earlier, that buying books and reading them are like two separate hobbies and everything. That's really the case with me. I buy a lot of them, but the reading process is really slow, and it's really
Yeah.
uh, I need to be better about it. I really need to. So yeah, these two are the ones I'm excited about.
No, I think it's very normal to like buy books, because yesterday I thought like I did a huge unhaul and I was like, I'm not gonna buy another book for the rest of the year. But then I went like my friend sent me books, like she sent me two fantasy books that I've been looking for. And then I went to say Book Bank, like the bookstore here, and I'm like, oh, I think I want some of these. So I feel like they are separate hobbies, and like we shouldn't beat ourselves up. I was talking to Risha yesterday from the Love of Classics, and she's like, I'm on a book buying ban. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I was like, I hope this sticks, because like readers, we know ourselves. Like we know, like we need to buy them even if we read them like 10 years later. So I think this is our conversation for today. We talked about a lot of different elements of the Pakistani English fiction, because we're not really tackling the Urdu fiction. I don't think we're qualified to do it yet. Once we start reading it, maybe then we can consider
Either.
making a video about it. So let me know if you guys enjoyed this video, or if you would like to see Bakhtawar back on this channel. This video will go on her channel as well, and we're going to upload it at the same time. So it's always interesting to film with like other people for sure, but definitely someone who understands your perspective on Pakistani fiction, because it's definitely one that's different from discussing Pakistani fiction with other people. So I will leave Bakhtawar's channel and her Instagram account linked below.
So, guys, I hope you enjoyed this little talk that we did. Let us know if you'd want us back on this platform. Although this is technically, Zoom is not a platform, but let us know if you'd want us to make more videos or discussions or anything like that. I will leave Nashwa's details, because this is also going up on my channel. I'll leave her details, her channel link, and everything in the description. And uh, thank you so much for sticking to the end, and take care of yourselves. Goodbye.